Welcome back, dear listener, or perhaps welcome for the very first time. You've arrived at the fireside of the nighttime historian, where the hour is late, the candle burns low, and the past drifts in like the scent of rain on old stone. Tonight, we turn our gaze to a Rome unlike the one sung about in hymns, a Rome gilded in candlelight and shadow, where the tiara of St. Peter crowned not a saint, but a man who bought the throne coin by coin, and where the keys of heaven were clutched in the hands of a family who would turn them into weapons. We will walk marble corridors scented with incense and musk, where whispers can wound as sharply as daggers, and where feasts end not with prayers, but with schemes in dark rooms. It is the story of the House of Borgia, of Rodrigo, who wore the papal white like armour, of Cesare, his son, who shed the cardinal's robe for steel and blood, and of Lucrezia, the daughter, whose smile was both a welcome and a warning. A dynasty born in ambition, bound by love and betrayal, and remembered as much for its myth as for its deeds. But before we step into tonight's tale, I invite you, if you'd like, to let me know where you are listening from in the comments. Perhaps it is in the deep quiet of a country house, or a narrow apartment in a city whose streets still echo after midnight, or somewhere far from home, journeying through unknown lands. Each place carries its own silence, and it is a joy to know the shape of the silence in which these words are heard. And if you find yourself returning to this fireside more than once, perhaps subscribe, though only if these stories linger with you long after the embers fade. So now, draw your blanket closer, let the day's noise ebb away, and join me to the eternal city, at the height of the Renaissance, where Latin hymns echo the halls, where secrets are kept in the folds of velvet, and where, for a fleeting moment, one family ruled as if they were gods. High in the apostolic palace, in a chamber lined with silk and shadow, the vicar of Christ lay dying. The summer heat clung to the air like old incense, sweet and spoiled, while the candles trembled in their sconces, as though they too feared what would come next. On the wide bed of velvet and lace, Pope Alexander VI, once Rodrigo Borgia, shivered beneath a golden quilt. His breath was shallow, his skin waxen. A ring had been removed from his hand, and a silver chalice stood untouched on the table beside him. No papal blessing was spoken, no final rites, only the soft steps of servants who did not meet each other's eyes, and the hush of a world holding its breath. Outside, Rome continued in a fever. The bells did not toll, the cardinals did not mourn. Whispers bloomed like mold in the corners of every palace. Was it poison? Was it justice? Or had God finally looked down and turned away? For 11 years this man had ruled the church like a sovereign, dispensing crowns and curses in equal measure, father to princes and master of Christendom's gold. And now he lay silent, not weeping, not gasping, just silent, as if some great hand had wiped the board clean, and no one dared to put the pieces back in place. Even the air seemed cautious, curling through the chamber like a rumour. Some say his son stood nearby, watching, red-eyed, hollow and afraid. Cesare, the Duke, the butcher general of Romagna. He too had fallen ill that night, though he would rise again before long, paler, slower, a shadow of the storm he once was. And others say it was Cesare who had lifted the chalice to his father's lips, or perhaps it was meant for him all along. Truth in these rooms died long before the body did. All that remained now was a question, humming just beneath the surface. How did it come to this? How did the House of Borgia rise so high, only to dissolve into dust and legend? That is the story we must now tell. As witnesses in the candlelight, to a time when the keys of heaven were made of gold and blood and lies. Long before his name was carved into stone, before Rome whispered of devils in papal robes, the boy was just Rodrigo, the second son of a middling house in the heat-slicked city of Valencia. He was born into no throne, no prophecy, no divine light. The air of his childhood smelled of river water and roasted almonds, spiced wine and sunburnt stone. His family, the Borgias, were not yet infamous, only ambitious. In Spanish they were Borgia, proud but provincial. Their fortunes rested in the church, in cousins and uncles who knew how to write letters and bend knees. When Rodrigo was still a boy, his uncle Alfonso rose higher than any Borgia before him, a cardinal first, then Pope Calixtus III. It was a crack in the sky, and through that crack, Rodrigo climbed. He was made a cardinal before his 30th year, not for piety but for blood. And yet once inside the Roman web, he spun his own with quiet genius. While other men clutched relics and chanted psalms, Rodrigo studied maps, courted alliances, and learned the rhythms of Rome, its hunger, its vanity, its thin veil of holiness stretched over a city of knives. He dressed well, he smiled often, he kissed rings when he must, and slipped coins when he need not. The great houses of Rome, the Orsini, the Colonna, the Della Rovere, watched him with thin smiles and colder eyes. To them, he was a foreign thread in the old Roman cloth, Valencian, vulgar, ambitious. But Rodrigo had learned something in Spain, that a man who is not born to power may still become its master if he can make himself useful enough to be tolerated and dangerous enough to be feared. He built his empire slowly. As Vice-Chancellor of the Church, Rodrigo Borgia did not preach, he negotiated. He ran the Vatican not as a temple, but as a court. He brokered deals between kings, secured tithes from distant cathedrals, and made Rome richer than it had been in 100 years. He kept mistresses in secret, fathered children in shadow, and named them in silence: Cesare, Juan, Lucrezia, all of them born beneath a mask he would never publicly remove. But the serpent was growing. It slid through the corridors of the Curia, coiled itself around papal seals and secret ledgers, waiting. The Roman lords scoffed at the Spaniard in crimson robes, even as they borrowed his gold. They whispered his name with scorn, but they could not stop him. Rodrigo knew that the papacy was not a matter of grace, it was a throne to be seized. And somewhere deep in the halls of the Vatican, he waited for his moment, knowing that when the next conclave came, it would not be the holiest man who won, but the one who had prepared the longest in the dark. They called it the Vice-Chancellor's palace, though it was no palace in truth, just a well-guarded Roman house nestled within a warren of courtyards and cloisters near the Vatican walls. But within its walls, power moved like a tide. Gold changed hands in silence. Letters arrived under wax seals and left with new commands. And in the midst of it all, calmly sipping black wine beneath a canopy of frescoed saints, sat Rodrigo Borgia. He had been Vice-Chancellor of the Holy Roman Church for over 30 years, longer than most cardinals lived. His robes were crimson, but always immaculately tailored. His rings changed with the season, and his guests never came once. If they were summoned, they returned again and again, drawn by favors, promises, or the quiet terror of his ledger. Rodrigo remembered everything: who owed him, who slighted him, who came hungry, and who would be made to kneel. His genius was not in oratory nor divine inspiration. It was in the game itself. a slow, patient harvesting of favors and debts, played across decades like a chess match in which only he knew all the pieces. He rarely raised his voice. He rarely threatened. He did not need to. A word from the Vice-Chancellor could make a bishop in Florence, or break a banker in Genoa. He built alliances as a spider builds webs, gently, precisely, with filaments of obligation so thin they were almost invisible. By the time his prey realized they were ensnared, it was already far too late. Even kings came to him cloaked in politeness, bearing tokens and secrets. He had a gift for listening just long enough, for smiling just broadly enough to put men at ease. But beneath the velvet, there was iron. Rodrigo Borgia did not forget, and he did not forgive without cost. He had grown immensely wealthy, discreetly without vulgarity. The Vatican coffers swelled beneath his stewardship, and many were content to ignore the whispers that followed. It was said he kept detailed records of every bribe he took, not out of shame, but for leverage. That he placed men in bishoprics not for holiness, but for loyalty. That cardinals who opposed him found themselves subtly sidelined, exiled to distant provinces, buried under quiet scandals, or slowly poisoned by rumor. And still, he smiled. Rome called him charming. Rome called him dangerous. The Roman families, ancient bloodlines like the Colonna, the Orsini, the Della Rovere, watched him from behind their lace curtains, muttering in Latin over wine and veal, as if words might stop him. But Rodrigo knew what they feared most. It was not the man he was. It was the dynasty he was building. Behind the red walls of the Vice-Chancellor's house lived his mistress, Vannozza dei Catanei, older now, clever, devout in her way. With her, he had fathered 4 children, though they bore no legal right to his name. There was Juan, bold and golden. There was Cesare, dark-eyed and brilliant. There was Lucrezia, still a child, delicate, luminous, too gentle for the world being built around her. And there was Joffre, the youngest, barely more than a whisper in the halls. To the world, Rodrigo was celibate. To Rome, he was sworn to God. But within the shadowed wings of his house, he was a patriarch. Not a pope, not yet, but a builder of bloodlines. And as he sat at his table each night, reading letters by candlelight while his children dined in the next room, he did not pray. He planned. The keys of heaven hung above his head, not yet his to claim, but closer than ever before. The current Pope, Innocent VIII, was old and ill. The College of Cardinals was restless. The world outside was shifting. France was stirring, Spain had just expelled its Jews, and the Italian states twisted around each other like snakes in a barrel. Rodrigo watched. Rodrigo waited. He knew that when Innocent finally died, there would be chaos, and chaos could be shaped. He would need allies. He would need coin. But above all, he would need to convince the men who feared him most that only he could preserve their fortunes. That the Borgia name, foreign, whispered, reviled, was not a threat but a solution. In this, Rodrigo Borgia would not be outmatched. He had waited his whole life for this game to end. And in the end, it would begin with gold. She was not the first, and not the last. But Vannozza dei Catanei was the one who endured. When she first came to Rodrigo, she was already married, twice in fact. Roman-born, modestly noble, with eyes that could soften or scald depending on the hour. She understood from the beginning what their arrangement would be. She was never going to be his wife. She would never kneel beside him in any chapel, nor stand behind him in marble portraits. But she would be the mother of his children, and that meant more than love. It meant permanence and legacy. Her name would remain ordinary, but her womb would be crowned in silence. And as Rome prayed beneath frescoed ceilings, she gave birth to Rodrigo's dynasty, first Cesare, then Juan, then Lucrezia, then Geoffrey, 4 children born out of intent and strategy. To the world, Rodrigo remained a man of God. His vows, at least in public, were unbroken. He presided over sermons, signed decrees, and offered blessings with spotless hands. But behind closed doors, he wove a new kind of priesthood, one made of flesh and inheritance. He arranged strategic marriages for Venozza to keep scandal at bay, moving her between names and husbands like a chess piece across a velvet board. Her houses were fine, but never too fine. Her life was comfortable, but never ostentatious. She lived in his shadow, but it was a wide and warm one, and her children were raised with books, tutors, silks, and secrets. In the house of Borgia, nothing was ever spoken plainly, but everyone understood their role. Juan, the golden one, would lead in splendor. Cesare, the shadowed one, would serve in silence. Lucrezia would marry where needed. And Geoffrey, well, Geoffrey would fill whatever space remained. Juan was the son Rodrigo had always craved, tall, striking, impulsive, adored by courtiers, and praised for little more than being beautiful. He was trained as a knight, not a priest, and Rodrigo showered him with gifts, titles, lands, the best tutors in Europe. He was marked for greatness, even if it would one day rot him from within. But it was Cesare who bore the weight of thought. Quiet where Juan was boastful, intense where his brother was charming. Cesare read Latin like poetry, and rode with an almost feral grace. Rodrigo saw in him something dangerous and unfinished, a brilliance wrapped in thorns. So he placed him in the church, not out of faith, but out of necessity. A cardinal's robe could keep a sword sheathed, for now. And then there was Lucrezia, still young, golden-haired, curious, the darling of the household. Everyone adored her, everyone underestimated her. Rodrigo's contradiction was complete. By day he walked among relics and altars, the image of discipline and sanctity. By night he dined with his children beneath candelabras, laughing gently at their quarrels, tracing futures in his wine-glass. Rome whispered, of course. Servants talked, letters passed. But the Borgia secret was not hidden, it was simply unacknowledged. Power had its own rules, and Rodrigo had mastered them. His children were insurance. In a world where popes came and went like storms, he was building longevity. He could not pass the tiara to a son, but he could pass land, wealth, and favor, and most of all, a name. The name Borgia had begun as an echo in a foreign tongue. Now it was being shaped into something Rome could not ignore. A legacy dressed in silk and red ink, held aloft by children born in shadow. But even strategy can breed affection, and Rodrigo, for all his masks, was not made of stone. He watched his children with a kind of possessive tenderness, a lion circling its cubs. He knew their flaws and their dangers, and he knew that soon the world would see them as threats. In the corridors of power, there is always a reckoning between what is shown and what is hidden. Rodrigo had built his house behind a veil, but veils do not last forever, and as the papal throne creaked under the weight of its dying occupant, the door Rodrigo had kept half closed all his life was about to swing open. They locked the doors at dusk. 93 cardinals, 1 dying church, and too many knives dressed as blessings. The Sistine Chapel was heavy with heat and incense, its walls cloaked in the gaze of painted prophets. But no one prayed. Not truly. The election of 1492 had begun, and in its silence, beneath the frescoed eye of God, The devil smiled, quietly, patiently, in the crimson robes of Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia. He sat near the center of the chapel, fingers interlaced, eyes low. He did not need to speak. He had already spoken, in private chambers, in candlelit walks through Vatican gardens, in the tight clasp of handshake and ring, where favors passed like communion wafers. Rodrigo knew each man here, his debts, his fears, his vanities, and he had counted them like rosary beads. Across the chamber, Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere sat stiffly, eyes sharp beneath his hood, whispering to a cluster of loyalists. Colonna, Orsini, Carafa, the old Roman lions. They hated Rodrigo, feared him, called him a foreigner, a Spaniard, a serpent who had slithered too close to Peter's throne. But hatred is a poor substitute for numbers. And Rodrigo had done his math. How many? He had asked the night before, his voice barely a breath. Ascanio Sforza stood beside the window, watching the moon crawl across the Vatican rooftops. If your gold holds, and your promises mean what they ought, 34, maybe 37. Enough, but barely. Rodrigo sipped his wine without smiling. Barely is plenty. Ascanio turned, folding his arms. You'll owe every one of them something. Rodrigo met his gaze. That's the point. Simony, they called it, the selling of holy offices, a sin by every measure. But in Rome it was tradition, titles for votes, abbeys for influence, and gold, always gold, passed in secret, handed to nephews, brothers, friends. Rodrigo had made promises so intricate, so layered in implication, that most would never even be claimed. Bishoprics in Spain, legations in Avignon, fortresses in the Papal States, a marriage here, a dispensation there. To some he gave nothing but the illusion of being heard. That was enough. To others he gave everything, and trusted they would forget his generosity once they needed him again. The ballots were cast over 2 long days. At night, Rodrigo did not sleep. He paced, he read, he whispered verses he no longer believed in. On the morning of the 3rd day, no smoke had risen. There was no decision. And so, after the Mass, Ascanio leaned in and whispered, "You must offer more." Rodrigo nodded, and he did. That night, in a shadowed corner of the Apostolic Library, he met with Cardinal Orsini. The man was old, trembling, but dangerous still. "You'll give my cousin the bishopric in Capua?" he asked, his voice a rasp. Rodrigo took his hand. "It is already done." "And my nephew, the command in Ostia?" Rodrigo did not blink. "He sails within the month." The cardinal studied him. "You know they'll call this a crime." Rodrigo smiled at last. "Only if I lose." When the ballots were opened the next morning, the silence was absolute. A single dove watched from the window ledge, feathers ruffled in the breeze. Rodrigo Borgia had won. It was not unanimous, but it was final, and Giuliano della Rovere stood without speaking. Others looked down, and some applauded, faintly. And the new pope rose, slowly and deliberately, lifting the white cassock from the table and setting aside the scarlet for good. He spoke triumphantly to no one in particular. "I will take the name Alexander, 6th of that line." Ascanio Sforza approached, bowed and kissed his ring, the first to do so. "Your Holiness," he whispered, "Rome is yours." Rodrigo's voice was soft. "Not yet, but it will be." Outside the bells began to toll. Smoke rose, white and pure, into the summer air. But beneath it, in 100 houses and hidden halls, men whispered the truth, that the throne of St. Peter had been bought, and that the serpent in scarlet now held the keys to heaven. The throne was made of gold, but the power was in the shadows. As Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia did not rule with lightning. He ruled with presence. He transformed the Vatican into something Rome had never seen. Not merely a seat of holy order, but a kingdom within a kingdom, pulsing with ambition, favors, and carefully curated scandal. The marble corridors were swept daily, but behind the draperies, lords plotted, lovers whispered, and cardinals weighed loyalty against legacy. At the center of it all, and always, was Rodrigo, robed in white, but never innocent, surrounded by acolytes and architects, confessors and spies. It was not the church he had inherited. It was the court he had built. Do you know what they call her? Cardinal della Rovere's voice was sharp as salt, echoing through the hall outside the papal library. His companion, a young bishop with careful eyes, shook his head. Who, Your Eminence? Giulia Farnese. The name dropped like a pebble into a well. They call her the Pope's whore, the bride of Christ. She was 19. A Roman noblewoman married off to a Farnese, old, dull, and distant. She had golden hair, eyes the color of forest glass, and a face so symmetrical it made artists weep. Rodrigo brought her into the papal household less than a year after his coronation. Officially, she was there to attend his daughter Lucrezia. In truth, she lived in chambers adjacent to his own. Ascanio Sforza had raised an eyebrow when she first arrived. "She'll cause trouble," he said quietly. Rodrigo hadn't looked up from his papers. "So does fire, but we still light it." The Roman family seethed. The Pope's mistress strolling through St. Peter's in embroidered silks, a daughter-in-law of devout Spain smiling in public processions. Rodrigo made no apology. He did not need to. His court was loyal, vibrant, and humming with activity. Artists received commissions, ambassadors received audiences, cardinals received warnings. Behind the curtain of scandal, the machine worked, and Rodrigo stood at its center like a conductor, never rushing the rhythm, only adjusting the pace. And then there was Lucrezia. She was 12 when Rodrigo was crowned. By 13 she had become a bargaining chip. The match was political, of course. It always was. Giovanni Sforza of Pesaro, a relative of Rodrigo's own ally, Ascanio. Young, titled and wealthy, but not bright, not bold, just useful. Lucrezia wept softly the night before the wedding, though no one heard her but the walls. In the audience hall, Rodrigo clasped the groom's shoulder with warm affection. "You are family now," he said, "and family is everything." Giovanni bowed. "I will honor her, Your Holiness." Rodrigo's smile lingered too long. "See that you do." The wedding was held in the Vatican gardens, an affair of roses and gold thread, musicians and murmurs. Giulia watched from behind her veil, unreadable. Lucrezia wore white, her face a mask of obedience. She walked down the aisle between two realms, childhood and duty. Giovanni kissed her hand before the altar, and Rodrigo gave the blessing with steady grace. Later, as night fell over Rome and laughter echoed through the palace, Ascanio found Rodrigo alone in the sola, gazing into the fire. "You could have waited," the cardinal murmured. Rodrigo did not turn. "Number her innocence is worth more now than it will be next year." "She's a child," said Ascanio. "She's a Borgia," Rodrigo said softly. "That is all the world sees, and so we must act before the world decides for us." By day, the court flourished. Festivals, appointments, foreign envoys bearing tribute. By night, Rodrigo played chess with flesh and future. He placed Cesare in red robes, made Juan the Duke of Gandia, arranged treaties with France and Spain alike. The Vatican no longer smelled only of incense. It smelled of jasmine and parchment, wax and silk, ink and desire. It was a palace of favors, a cathedral of family. And beneath it all, beneath the jewels and laughter, the weddings and whispers, Rodrigo could feel the tension pulling tight. Rome did not forget. Rome waited. Behind every toast was a dagger yet undrawn. Rain fell the morning the Portuguese arrived, sharp, cold, insistent. It drummed against the Vatican's leaded windows as Cardinal Ascanio Sforza read aloud the list of demands sent ahead by Joan II, King of Portugal. Across the chamber, Pope Alexander VI stared at the flames in the hearth, tapping a finger against the armrest of his throne. "He wants Africa," Ascanio muttered. "The roots, the gold, the islands, and the sea beyond." Rodrigo said nothing. "And if Spain contests it?" Rodrigo's gaze didn't move. "They will." The Spanish delegation had arrived days earlier, proud, sun-drenched, and triumphant. They brought word of the Colombian voyage with silks from Castile, and a carved ivory chest filled with cocoa and coloured feathers. Columbus himself had not come. He was in Barcelona, wrapped in ceremonies and doubt. But his shadow preceded him. Rodrigo had greeted them in the Sala Regia, where the floor smelled faintly of rosemary and wet stone. Queen Isabella's letter had been pressed into his palm with reverence. He read it alone that night, beneath the glow of a single candle. "God has smiled on Spain," she wrote, "and in his smile we see the duty of his vicar." The Portuguese entered 2 days later, colder, sharper, with documents, maps, and carefully restrained contempt. They had long dominated the seas around Africa and beyond. For them, Columbus was an interloper, a Genoese amateur sailing under borrowed colours. The Portuguese ambassador, Diogo de Azambuja, bowed low before the Pope, but did not smile. "You've heard their claim," he said after the formal greetings. "Now hear ours. Portugal has treaties, charts, and precedents. These lands lie within our sphere. Spain overreaches." Rodrigo folded his hands. "They say the same." "Then give us a line," Diogo whispered, "and place it where the world will remember who discovered it first." The Vatican corridors filled with murmurs. Cardinals took sides behind closed doors. Spanish gold flowed to certain hands, Portuguese jewels to others. Rodrigo did not declare allegiance, he observed. He walked the gardens and summoned cartographers. He prayed with a cool expression and kept every promise vague. But in the early hours of one morning, he spoke plainly to Ascanio Sforza beside a rain-streaked window. "They are both children of Christ," he said, "but only one behaves like it." "You'll choose Spain." Rodrigo hesitated. "I'll choose Rome." He summoned both delegations to the Hall of Constantine, a chamber lined with frescoes of Constantine the Great, conquering with the cross. Torches flickered in the bronze brackets. The tables were set with parchment, sealed scrolls, and fresh ink. Rodrigo entered last, dressed in a simple white cassock that glowed beneath the painted ceiling. His voice echoed as he spoke. "You seek dominion," he began, "but come before the throne of Peter to ask for peace. Christ said the meek shall inherit the earth. You ask me to decide which empire may inherit the sea." He turned to the Spaniards. "You claim discovery." Then to the Portuguese. "You claim inheritance." To both, but you do not ask whose hands will be clean. There was silence. Then murmured protest. Diogo de Azambuja stepped forward. "Holy Father, our king fears only that chaos will follow if the world is left unmarked. We do not ask for conquest, only clarity." Rodrigo studied him. Clarity is the gentlest name for hunger I've heard this week. One of the Spanish envoys, a nobleman named Mendoza, knelt, almost theatrically. "We wish to spread the gospel," he said, "but we must first know where to plant the cross." Rodrigo raised a brow. "Then let the cross come with a compass." The next 3 nights were spent in deliberation. The Pope dined alone and reviewed letters from Spain, reviewed coin ledgers, listened to spies. Cesare came to him once, unbidden, standing at the door like a statue. "You should let them fight for it," Cesare said. "Divide the globe with blood. That's how the earth has always been carved." Rodrigo didn't look at him. That's how Rome was built, not how it must be remembered. On June 7th, 1494, the decree was written. A line was fixed, straight and elegant, cutting through the Atlantic Ocean from pole to pole, 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands, everything east of the line, to Portugal, everything west, to Spain. The Treaty of Tordesillas was inked in Latin, stamped with the papal seal, and carried on silk cushions to both courts. It passed through hands that trembled with anticipation and envy. Rodrigo stood over the map long after the others had gone. Ascanio returned with wine, but did not speak. The candles flickered. Rain tapped faintly on the glass. "They will call it an act of God," Ascanio said. Rodrigo traced the line with his finger. "Let them. The gods of empire always wear white robes." He said, "You've written yourself into history. I've written a question they'll spend centuries answering." That night, in the quiet of his private study, Rodrigo dipped his quill again. Not to draw lines, but to begin new letters, to Spain, to Portugal, to merchants and kings. He knew the treaty would not prevent war, but it would delay it, long enough for Rome to remain at the center. The papacy had once offered absolution, now it offered direction. Rodrigo had shaped the very geography of ambition, and for a moment the world belonged to him. The Vatican at night was never silent. The marble breathed and the tapestries whispered. Somewhere beneath the floor, a monk coughed in his sleep, and above the courtyard, the night watch murmured psalms with bored devotion. But in the Pope's private study, the only sound was ink scratching across paper. Rodrigo sat hunched over letters, his candle guttering low, the hour past confession, and well into reckoning. He paused only once, to look toward the door. It was shut, but he could feel the weight behind it, his sons, his sins. Juan had returned that evening from a hunting trip near Viterbo, laughing too loud, smelling of wine and leather. He tossed a dead pheasant at a servant's feet and demanded salted almonds, speaking in half Spanish, half Roman slang that made the guards wince. Rodrigo watched him from the corridor above, unseen. He couldn't decide whether he saw his legacy or his liability in that face. The boy had charm, yes, and pride. But pride cracked easily. It wore no armor. "Your son," Ascanio Sforza said that night, sipping wine in the corner of the solar, "would make a fine marble statue." Rodrigo turned to him. "Marble doesn't lead armies." "No," Ascanio replied. "Indeed, the same hammer that carves them can break them." Cesare arrived the next morning. His robes were cardinal red, but his hands were calloused, his jaw tight. He had returned from Ancona with word of unrest in the Papal States. Peasants rioting, nobles withholding taxes. His tone was cold, precise. Rodrigo listened, then dismissed the aides, leaving only father and son in the chamber. "You should have sent me to the field," Cesare said quietly. "Juan can barely hold a sword without looking at himself in the reflection." "You are in the church," Rodrigo answered, keeping his eyes on a map of Romagna. Juan leads armies. You command respect. I command nothing, Cesare snapped, except hymns. Rodrigo looked up. This family rules because we know how to place our pieces. You're exactly where I need you. I am not a piece, Cesare said, stepping closer. I'm the son of the Pope. Rodrigo stood slowly. Exactly. You're a Borgia. That means you wait. You endure. You survive. That is the only truth Rome respects. The tension thickened with each passing month. Rome whispered like a jealous lover, of cardinals kept in brothels, of dinners served on gold, of Lucrezia's laughter lingering too long outside her brother's door. The rumors swirled through the palazzos and cloisters alike, each tale darker than the last. There were priests who claimed to have heard confessions no penance could cleanse. There were merchants who swore the Pope's treasury held more silver than Christendom itself. The word incest was never spoken above a whisper, but it was whispered often. At banquets, Juan bragged of his campaigns, his lovers, his horses. He mocked Cesare in public, calling him the bishop with a blade. He once poured wine on his brother's vestments as a joke. Cesare said nothing, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. Rodrigo saw the fracture forming, and for the first time he hesitated. Power was no longer a crown. It was a flame, and it was licking at the floorboards beneath his own table. One night, as Rome slept uneasily and the stars hung low over the Tiber, Rodrigo walked the Vatican halls alone. The candles were low. The portraits of saints stared down with cracked solemnity. He stopped before one, St. Peter holding the keys, and whispered aloud, "They call me unholy. They forget Peter was a man before he was a saint." A voice answered from behind him, "And Judas was too." Rodrigo turned. Cesare stood in the dark, arms folded. He stepped into the light. "If you keep favoring Juan, you will lose both of us." Rodrigo studied his son. "You were made for greater things. Patience." Cesare shook his head. "Number only war now." And then he left, his shadow long against the stone. The whispers did not stop. They multiplied. But Rodrigo, ever the architect, kept building. He tightened his grip on the Vatican. He appointed loyal bishops. He sent emissaries to France. He smiled at banquets, even as the poison gathered in his own wine. Power, he had learned, was not taken once. It was taken every day, every hour, every breath. And in his breath, there was the echo of a storm. The body was pulled from the Tiber before sunrise. Waterlogged, pale and slashed in half a dozen places, it snagged against a stone pier near the Castel Sant'Angelo. A fisherman found it. He crossed himself, dropped his net, and ran. The guards who arrived an hour later did not know what to say. The corpse wore the fine boots of a nobleman. His rings had been stripped. A velvet sash, red, soaked dark, clung to one shoulder like a wound. When the sun rose, the body had a name: Juan Borgia. The news reached Rodrigo as he broke his fast. He was seated in the solar with Lucrezia, spooning honey into her tea, when a chamberlain whispered it in his ear. His hand froze in mid-air. The spoon clinked against the porcelain as it fell. "Leave us," he said. His voice was low, but it turned the room to ice. Lucrezia looked up. She didn't ask. She didn't need to. Something terrible had walked into the room. She stood. "Is it Cesare?" Rodrigo shook his head, slowly. "No." "Then who?" He looked at her, and his eyes said what his mouth could not. Juan's body was brought in under heavy guard. Rodrigo stood over it with his hand over his mouth, his knuckles white. The wounds were deliberate, controlled. A blade had moved with skill, not frenzy. The face was bruised, but still recognizable. That proud nose, that foolish half-smile now frozen in ruin. Cesare stood in the back of the hall, silent in his cardinal robes, his arms crossed tight. Ascanio Sforza whispered, "We should bury him quietly." Rodrigo stood over the body in the dim hall, the smell of river water still clinging to Juan's torn velvet. Whispers from the guards spoke of the city already alive with rumor, but Rodrigo let them swell unchecked. His gaze drifted to the back of the room, where Cesare watched in the crimson robes of a cardinal, arms folded, his expression carved from something colder than stone. Rodrigo searched that face for the tremor of grief, for anything that might confirm or deny the thought already taking root in his mind, but found only a calm that unsettled him more than any denial could. 3 days later, under a sky heavy with rain, the burial passed without fanfare. No music, no procession, only the scrape of shovels and the soft hiss of water on umbrellas. Lucrezia knelt, motionless, her lips unmoving in prayer. When she rose, her eyes met Cesare's, holding him in silence for a moment too long. That evening, she crossed the cloister to where her brother stood alone, turning a coin between his fingers, the glint of metal catching the last of the light. Whatever words passed between them were not meant for others to hear, but when they parted, the coin was gone, and her gaze had darkened. Rodrigo stopped eating. He wandered the halls at night. Once he collapsed in the chapel, and they said he wept into the marble. He had loved Juan more than he should have, more than was wise, and in Juan's absence, the palace echoed differently, as though something vital had been pulled from its bones. He called Cesare to his chambers a week after the burial. No guards, no servants, just father and son, seated in flickering candlelight. "I don't know if you did it," Rodrigo said. "I don't know if I want to know." Cesare remained still. "You needed him to be a prince." Rodrigo looked at him. "And you? I am not what you wanted, but I'm what's left." In the weeks that followed, the Pope grew distant. He spoke less in public. When ambassadors came, they found him distracted. The balance of power had shifted, subtly but completely. Cesare began to rise. He took on Juan's duties, met with captains, approved military purchases. He moved through the halls with a new silence, the kind that clings to men who have done something irreversible. Rome whispered. Some said Juan had been murdered by jealous rivals. Others said it was political, the price of ambition. But most believed only one theory. Cesare had wanted what his brother had, and now he had it. The river, they said, does not carry the truth. It only carries the body. That summer, Rodrigo stood before the College of Cardinals and spoke of sin, of judgment, of the need for order in a world filled with chaos. He did not mention his son, but everyone heard him clearly. The Pope had survived heartbreak, and now only one Borgia son remained to shape the future, and he no longer wore a mask. They waited for him in the courtyard at dawn. Cardinals, guards, scribes, all watching as Cesare Borgia walked across the flagstones in silence, his red robe billowing behind him like spilled wine. A servant followed, carrying a chest heavy with gold, sealed letters, and the document Cesare had completed in his own hand the night before, a renunciation, signed and final. He reached the steps of the apostolic palace and paused. The sun caught the Vatican's windows, gilding them in fire. Without a word, he placed his ring into the waiting hand of a papal aide, the gesture deliberate and unhurried. The eyes around him followed the movement as if it were the last turn of a key in a long-locked door. The news travelled through Rome like a summer storm. The cardinal's son had shed the cloth, exchanging the scarlet of the church for the mantle of his own choosing. It had not been forced upon him, it had been claimed. In the chapel, Rodrigo read the letter alone, while bishops lingered on the edges of the room, unsure whether to speak. At the doorway, Ascanio Sforza watched with folded arms, his expression somewhere between warning and resignation. Rodrigo set the parchment aside without lifting his gaze. The gesture alone made it clear that the decision was beyond reversal. In France, a new king weighed his ambitions. Louis XII needed Rome's blessing to dissolve his marriage, access to Italy, and the kind of alliance that could shift the balance of power. Cesare travelled under a false name, though recognition followed him at every port, until in Lyon the court whispered a new one, Il Valentino. He entered dressed in black, his blade polished to a mirror sheen, crimson edging his cloak like a signal. Behind closed doors, with no audience but the king, arrangements were struck. Ambitions aligned like mirrors facing each other. The Pope would grant the annulment. France would arm the Pope's son with men, titles, and the ducal name of Valentino. When Cesare returned to Rome, the red robes were gone. Steel now wrapped his frame, the air about him heavier, sharpened. In a private chamber, Rodrigo studied him with the measured stillness of a man calculating more than he spoke. The silence between them was loaded, an acknowledgement that a boundary had been crossed, and that each now carried something the other needed. Decisions were made without ceremony: lands, titles, alliances, and the next step for the family. Lucrezia's first marriage had already withered under suspicion and humiliation. Giovanni Sforza had failed to produce an heir, and had failed even more completely to command respect. She had retreated to a convent in the wake of his absence, shrouding herself in quiet. When the matter was finally brought to her, it came with an unspoken understanding. She would be released, but the manner of it would wound her reputation. The implication of impotence would be enough to free her in law, though it would also follow her like a shadow. She absorbed the terms without argument, her eyes lowered to the rim of her wine cup, the stillness in her frame suggesting both reluctance and resolve. The annulment was swift, public, and devastating to her former husband. Giovanni Sforza fled north, scattering venom in letters and whispered audiences, stories of incest, conspiracy, and corruption that clung to the family name. Neither Rodrigo nor Cesare rose to answer him, but Lucrezia emerged from the storm altered. The softness in her demeanour was tempered with something steadier, her gaze longer in its reach. She had been moved like a piece on a board, but there was no mistaking that she was beginning to consider her own moves. With France behind him, and the Sforza alliance dissolved, Cesare moved as though the city itself were a chessboard. He met condottieri beneath the cover of gardens and arcades. He swore captains to his service in the secrecy of torch-lit halls. In the Sistine Chapel, his sword received a blessing, and his standard, a red bull on a field of gold, climbed the Vatican walls. The transformation was complete, from prince of the church to commander of men, from servant of scripture to architect of war. Rome began to shift with him, its heartbeat quickening under the rhythm of his march. Across the misty valleys of Romagna, silence arrived before the marching sounds of soldiers. Town by town, fortress by fortress, men awoke to the strange absence of bells. No alarms or warnings, just banners rising at dawn and gates opening to strangers. No one resisted, not yet at least. Cesare Borgia had arrived with thunder and intent. They called him Il Valentino now. He rode at the head of a glinting column of French cavalry, his armor blackened and edged in silver, his standard a golden bull with lowered horns. The Pope had named him Gonfalonier of the Church. The King of France had named him Duke of Valentinois. But Cesare moved as though the titles were merely a frame for something larger, something he intended to define himself. In Faenza, the city's elders were received without spectacle. Cesare listened to their grievances against Rome in silence, pouring their wine with the patience of a man weighing more than their words. By the time the cups were set down, their decision was already made. At Urbino, there was no such courtesy. He rode to the citadel with 300 Gascon lancers in perfect wordless formation. The Duke fled into the hills before the gates could be barred. Cesare walked the emptied halls without unsheathing his blade, glancing once to the scribe who followed him, a glance that conveyed enough. By dusk, new banners hung from the ramparts. It was in Imola that he first encountered the man who would one day render him in ink, Niccolò Machiavelli. The Florentine envoy arrived in the rain, boots stained from the road, cloak thin against the cold. He found Cesare on a balcony, the Duke's eyes fixed on the rooftops below, reading the city as though it were a map only he could decipher. Their meeting was brief, but it left the envoy watching him with the sharp attention of a man who had found his subject. For weeks, Machiavelli trailed the campaign. He saw Cesare unmake enemy alliances with parchment rather than steel, turn rival mercenaries with quiet promises in the dark, and walk into towns whose gates opened in submission rather than surrender. The pattern was clear. Cesare did not conquer like a warlord. He spread like a condition, efficient, inescapable, and unnervingly precise. In IV.ii, Caterina Sforza defied him. She sealed the gates and rallied her soldiers, forcing a siege that dragged into the cold. Cesare gave no speeches, offered no terms. Each day the pressure grew until the walls finally broke. His men entered under cover of night, pulling her sons from their chambers, and brought her before him in chains. The exchange between them was curt, measured, the language of two people who understood the value of appearances. She left alive, though diminished, her survival as calculated as her capture. By winter, Romagna bore new colors. Cesare's governance was ruthless in its order. Rebels vanished without trace. Justice arrived without delay. Taxes were collected as precisely as troop movements. Streets were cleared, records kept, roads patrolled. Even the poorest began to acknowledge a grim improvement, not born of affection, but of predictability. In Rome, Rodrigo received each report with pride tempered by an unease he never voiced. What he had set loose now moved beyond the reach of his hand. Lucrezia, watching from Ferrara, sent her brother a letter in which she wrote of storms and the danger of forgetting the way home. No reply was ever found. Behind all of it, in the margins of his notebook, Machiavelli recorded each maneuver. The observations became sketches, then principles, the outline of a leader who ruled not through affection, but through control, who betrayed without hesitation when necessity demanded, who shaped his fate through will, rather than birthright. Cesare once remarked to the envoy that if he fell, the story should be told as he deserved. Machiavelli, closing his book, gave no answer. Some endings, he knew, did not need to be written in advance. But campaigns, like endings, are always finished in shadow. The wedding took place in the height of summer, beneath gold-threaded banners and canopies of crushed lilac. Rome sweltered under a white sky. The Vatican gardens glimmered with water spilled from marble fountains, and the air was thick with the mingled scents of roses and incense. Cardinals stood along the paths like still red sentinels. Music threaded through the heat from shadowed balconies. At the centre, Lucrezia Borgia stood poised in a gown of Neapolitan blue, her veil trailing like mist over marble. Her eyes revealed nothing. She had been married before and humiliated. This time, the posture was different, deliberate, guarded. Across from her, Alfonso of Aragon, 17 lean and dark-eyed, carried himself with the trained poise of a soldier who had learned to hide nerves. His features were almost too fine for the role he would be expected to play. For now, there was a fragile equilibrium between them, the kind that could hold or shatter without warning. In the days before the ceremony, the papal library became a room of unspoken strategy. Rodrigo's steps echoed between the bookshelves as he studied maps and correspondence. His attention moved between Naples, France, and Spain, like a general assessing fronts. Lucrezia, seated near a high window, watched him weigh the future as though it were a coin. She understood she was being placed, not as a daughter, but as an instrument. His glance toward her carried the unvoiced truth. She was expected to anchor Naples to Rome, to serve as both bridge and barrier. The air between them carried no tenderness, only shared recognition of the stakes. That evening, the chapel candles burned low. Cesare found her there, the air smelling faintly of wax and rain from the open door. They did not speak, but their eyes met in a silent exchange that was heavier than any vow. His gaze lingered with warning. Hers held the cool certainty of someone who had already measured the risks and chosen to proceed. The wedding itself moved without flaw. The Pope's blessing rang clear beneath the vaulted ceiling. Alfonso's Latin, steady if subdued, drifted into the garden beyond. Lucrezia met his gaze in a way that held him fast, a signal, perhaps, that this was not a union built solely on ceremony. Later, in the palazzo gifted by Rodrigo, the light from dozens of candles moved across silk and polished wood, as they regarded one another in the stillness. The absence of warmth between them was not yet hostility, but it was a void that each seemed aware of. Weeks passed, and Lucrezia's presence began to shift. She walked the Curia corridors with a new precision, her pace unhurried but deliberate. She hosted her own salons, drawing diplomats and artists alike. Correspondence began to pass through her hands, some sealed for foreign courts, others carrying marks in a code few could read. When Rodrigo was occupied, she received envoys in his place, her tone measured, her gestures exact. In Naples, her name began to carry a weight beyond her dowry. Reports reached the king's household that she moved through the Vatican, not as a guest, but as if the corridors had been built for her. Still, suspicion clung to the edges of the marriage. Alfonso's charm was evident, but his loyalties were unclear. Cesare's wariness of him was equally constant. Lucrezia noticed the way her husband stiffened in certain audiences, or the subtle hesitation when her brother's name was mentioned. Once, in the quiet of their chambers, she studied the way he glanced toward the door, more often than toward her, as if gauging unseen threats. She knew the danger of such habits in a house like hers, danger that would not always come from behind. For a time, peace held. Lucrezia's reach extended quietly. She formed alliances with artists, secretaries, and midwives as deftly as she navigated court etiquette. She contributed to hospitals, appeared in processions with flowers woven into her hair, and allowed the people to see her as both untouchable and familiar. Whispers in Rome shifted from pity to admiration. Even Rodrigo now regarded her less as a daughter to be protected and more as a force to be managed. In Ferrara and Florence, her name began to move through letters with equal parts intrigue and respect. Cesare observed this transformation with an intensity that rarely softened. It was not the kind of power he wielded, yet he recognized it for what it was, dangerous in its subtlety, more enduring than the edge of a sword. The pattern on the board was changing. The young woman who had once been moved like a pawn was now charting her own lines of attack. In public, her gestures still appeared dutiful, but in the shadowed corners of court life, her influence began to press against boundaries no one had imagined for her. The game, once about her survival, was now hers to shape. And somewhere, in the unseen spaces between alliances, a piece was already marked to fall. The blow came without warning, late summer, just after Vespers, in the dusky hush of the palace courtyard. Alfonso had only just dismounted, the reins still in his hand, when steel slid from the shadows. The first strike cut deep into his thigh. The second slashed across his shoulder. A third aimed for his ribs but glanced off. He staggered, blood pouring into the dust, collapsing beside the fountain. The guards hesitated, their shouts too slow to matter. By the time they moved, the attackers were gone. Alfonso's life hung by a thread. Lucrezia found him pale and gasping, stretched on a linen-covered table, the air thick with the scent of iron and crushed herbs. Physicians crowded around, their hands stained, their voices sharp with urgency. She knelt beside him, her movements steady, brushing the sweat from his brow. The city outside was already swelling with rumor. Orsini blades, Neapolitan vengeance, or the long arm of Cesare Borgia. The last was spoken most often. Cesare offered no denial. He offered nothing at all. In the days that followed, Alfonso's chambers became a barricade of vigilance. Guards stood at the door. Physicians moved in constant rotation. Lucrezia stayed within reach of the bed, sleeping in a chair, waking at every sound. For a time he seemed to recover. His wounds knit. His color improved. He could speak, even attempt to smile. Rodrigo visited once, his hand resting briefly on Alfonso's shoulder before leaving without ceremony. The air between them was taut, unsoftened by the courtesy of words. Cesare remained distant. His absence was its own presence, a quiet shadow at the edge of every conversation. Outside the palace walls, his name traveled faster than proof. That winter, the protection around Alfonso began to thin. First the extra guards, then the trusted physician, then the priest whose nightly visits grew irregular. Each removal came without explanation, like pieces quietly lifted from a board. And then, one night, Lucrezia was called away to the chapel. Moments later, a servant arrived breathless, unable to speak at first. Alfonso had been found in his bed, a silk cord at his throat. No wound, no struggle, only the deliberate stillness of a death delivered by steady hands. Lucrezia returned too late. She stood at the foot of the bed, her face calm, her posture unbroken, her hands still clasped from prayer. She touched his forehead once, as if closing a final door, and later burned the gown she had worn on their wedding day. No inquiry followed. No tribunal was summoned. The official record spoke only of sudden decline. He was buried with solemnity, but without honor, his name spoken once in mass before it was set aside. In the palace, the silence was absolute, but behind it, in every private corner and half-lit corridor, the same name was breathed over and over, Cesare. When he appeared at her door days later, she admitted him without a word. They regarded each other in the firelight, the quiet between them harder than any accusation. Whatever passed in that moment was not forgiveness, nor was it rage. It was recognition of what had been done and why it had been allowed. Rodrigo never spoke of it again. Not to his daughter, not to his son, and certainly not in prayer. But something in the balance had shifted. A marriage, an alliance, a life, all gone in the space of a season. And still, the knives within the Borgia house remained honed, waiting for the next stroke. Rome had never seen such a papacy. Cities that once defied the Holy See now flew its banners. Borgia gold moved through every artery of the church, and the Vatican gleamed under new frescoes, saints and angels looking down upon the family who had turned the throne of Peter into a hereditary power. Rodrigo, long past the careful diplomacy of his early reign, now moved through the curia with the weight of expectation. His table overflowed with envoys and captains. Titles were granted as easily as blessings, excommunications issued with the faintest gesture. At his side, always, was Cesare, the campaign in Romagna complete, the rebellious lords crushed, the cities bound to governors chosen for loyalty over lineage. The roads were secure, the borders held, the vaults full. Every rival who had laughed at a Borgia principality was silent or gone. In the private gardens, father and son bent over a map, the air cool with winter. Lines were traced, borders imagined, each territory a pulse in the growing body of their dominion. That same winter, Cesare was invested as Duke of Romagna, wearing the title like a weapon, while Lucrezia ruled Ferrara with letters that crossed borders carrying strategy rather than ceremony. The three of them now stood in separate citadels, Rodrigo in Rome, Cesare in the field, Lucrezia in her northern court, bound by blood and ambition, yet beyond their reach, the Roman barons whispered again. Old enemies who had bowed for years began to sense an imbalance. Giuliano della Rovere returned from France, his step slower, but his resolve unchanged, and began to draw visitors to his monastery after dark. Word of his movements reached Rodrigo's desk within days, but no alarm was sounded. In the palace, the rhythm of banquets and processions continued, yet a faint change in the air betrayed a gathering opposition. A dagger appeared in the papal gardens one morning, its hilt driven into the soil with a note pinned beneath, "Eternal is an illusion." The season shifted and France sent fewer gifts. Spain sent none. Servants passed folded letters through candlelit corridors, and the cardinals met in twos, never in open council. Rodrigo tired more quickly, his hands sometimes unsteady when lifting the host. Cesare's conquests continued, but his appetite had cooled. His movements became sharper, less lingering. His decisions made with an urgency that cut away loose ends before they could fray. In the private chapel, the family gathered once, Rodrigo staring up at angels whose faces he no longer remembered commissioning, Lucrezia resting her hands over the life within her, Cesare fixed on the altar in silence. Each understood, without speaking it, that what had been built was finite, and that its unraveling had already begun. Beyond the Vatican walls, Giuliano della Rovere prayed before a weathered statue of St. Michael, his petitions made not for mercy, but for the moment to strike. The crown still shone, but the air had turned cold, and the listening shadows had already stepped inside. No one can say with certainty what happened that night. There's not even a record, no proclamation or confession, only fragments, candlelight against velvet walls, gold coins glinting before they vanished into shadows, laughter echoing through marbled halls long after the feast was over. It might have been invention or warning, or a weapon disguised as a story, but it was told and retold until it took on a life of its own. The setting, they claimed, was the private salons of the papal apartments, rooms steeped in silk, scented with musk, guarded from the pious world outside. Cesare had returned to Rome in triumph. Lucrezia was radiant after her arrival from Ferrara, and Rodrigo, flushed and imperious, had ordered a celebration to remind Christendom where power truly lived. The guest list was short and deliberate. Cardinals, generals, ambassadors, and courtiers, who would be believed when they carried tales home. The evening began as any other gathering of the powerful, measured conversation, music drifting under the frescoed ceilings, dancers from Venice moving like shadows through the light, wine poured into open-mouthed goblets, dark and heavy. Then came the chestnuts, and the women. Dozens of courtesans entered adorned only in jewels, their steps choreographed for the gaze of the room. Coins were scattered, and the women crawled to collect them, each movement deliberate. The contest itself an unspoken display of ownership. Lucrezia, the story went, sat expressionless beside Cesare, while Rodrigo observed with the detachment of a man appraising a work commissioned for his own pleasure. There was no blood, no violence. That absence made the telling worse. What was remembered was the precision, the confidence, the way pleasure was turned into ceremony. Servants whispered to the city. Priests spoke of blasphemy in the streets. One Venetian letter smuggled north read only, "They believe they are gods now, and perhaps the real ones are watching." The Borgias denied everything, but denial could not touch the story once it had escaped the walls. It survived because it was never only about the night. It was about what seemed possible in a court where a father had bought the church, a son had carved his own dominion, and a daughter was wrapped in calculated mystery. To Machiavellian Florence, it was confirmation of what he had already written in private, that they no longer bothered to hide their reach, and might no longer remember how to fear. Yet the celebration left its own mark inside the family. Rodrigo began to tire, lingering more often in bed, forgetting names. Cesare prowled the halls at night, not as a ruler surveying his domain, but as if searching for something that had slipped away. Lucrezia returned to Ferrara without ceremony. The banquet had been meant as a display of triumph, but it became a mirror held too close, a reflection that neither they nor their enemies could unsee. Even when the silk was replaced and the walls scrubbed clean, the tale remained, half true and half warning, the spark of a legend that would outlive them all. Winter came heavy and wet that year, smothering the roads in mist. Cesare moved through Romagna like a shadow stitched into the land, his banners low, his pace unhurried, his silence deliberate. Word spread quickly that the Pope's son wished to reconcile. Those who had resisted him, the Orsini captains, the Vitelli brothers, the remnants of the old alliances, were invited to meet him in Senigallia under the promise of pardon. Letters carried the right phrases: honor, peace, the return of lands. The city itself was a hushed stage. Snow clung to the rooftops, melting into rivulets along the stone. Markets were closed, doors latched. Cesare arrived first, taking quarters in a fortress overlooking the harbour. Fires burned low in the great hall. His captains waited in silence, sharpening blades they would not yet admit to drawing. By midday, the guests arrived, weary, cloaked, and unarmed by agreement. They were received with warmth. Wine was poured. Old grievances were acknowledged, brushed aside, folded neatly into the illusion of trust. The smell of roasting meat mingled with the salt air from the docks. Even the snow seemed to pause, drifting lazily in the stillness. And then, without a raised voice or a warning, the door to the hall was barred. The guards stepped forward. The tone of the room changed in a heartbeat. Warmth to cold, welcome to sentence. Cesare remained seated, watching as his captains took each man by the shoulder, leading them away in pairs. Outside, the streets were silent save for the muffled thud of boots and the quick, wet finality of steel. When it was over, the hall was empty, but for the Duke of Valentinois and the fire. No proclamations were issued, no accusations were written. By nightfall the bodies were gone, buried in snow or dragged into the tide. In Rome the news arrived stripped of detail but heavy with effect. The last pockets of resistance in the Papal States had been cut out like a sickness. The purge was quick, the message lingered. The bells tolled for a pope, but their sound was not grief, it was hunger. The streets of Rome filled with processions, but in every curtained window and shadowed cloister, deals were already being struck. Alexander VI was dead, and with him, the only shield Cesare Borgia had ever truly trusted. The conclave was swift and merciless. The cardinals moved as men who had been waiting years for this moment, their whispers sharpened to agreements before the doors even closed. Among them, returning from years of patient exile, was Giuliano della Rovere, the man Rodrigo had outbid, outmaneuvered, and humiliated for the papal throne over a decade before. Age had carved his face into granite, but the eyes were still the same, unblinking, calculating, patient in the way of a man who understood revenge as an art. The vote moved toward him, like iron filings to a magnet. The French favoured him. The discontented Roman families, Orsini, Colonna, saw in him a weapon against the Borgia shadow. Even some of those Cesare had bought in gold years before now traded their loyalty for survival. When the smoke rose from the Sistine Chapel, it was white. Giuliano della Rovere stepped forward in white and gold, his jaw set, his hands steady. He took the name Julius II. Cesare stood in the piazza, the crowd pressing close. The new pope's gaze passed over him from the balcony, holding for just a fraction longer than courtesy demanded. It wasn't a greeting, it was a verdict. The first blow came quickly. Cesare's titles were questioned. His troops, many still loyal to France, were recalled to their garrisons. His access to the papal treasury was cut, and when Julius invited him to the Vatican for a discussion of mutual interests, Cesare arrived under guard and left under lock. The city understood instantly. The reign of the Borgias was no longer a fact. It was a question, one that Julius II intended to answer in his own time. For now, Cesare was confined within the walls that had once opened to him like a second skin. Outside, the streets whispered his name, but not as they once had. Not with fear, with curiosity, the kind reserved for fallen lions. And in those first days of Julius's papacy, one truth settled over Rome like dusk over stone. The knives were out again, and this time they were all pointed in the same direction. Prison in the Vatican was not chains and rags, not for Cesare Borgia. His rooms were richly furnished, the meals well prepared, the guards polite. But it was a prison nonetheless. The corridors he had once walked as master were now lined with men who did not answer his greetings. Messages were intercepted. Letters from Lucrezia arrived in torn envelopes, the seals clumsily replaced. Each day the sound of Julius II's court drifted through the walls. Voices that had once sought his favor now murmuring in alliance with his enemy. Cesare still believed he could turn it, of course. He was no stranger to reversals. He had built his fortune on taking the board mid-game and bending it to his will. But the pieces were no longer his to move. Julius stalled every petition, stripped more of his garrisons, and quietly summoned envoys from Spain and France. It was the French who offered the first lifeline. King Louis XII sent word that he would honor the alliance made with the Borgias, but only if Cesare could come to him in person. The problem was leaving Rome alive. Julius was careful. He allowed Cesare to depart the Vatican under the pretense of traveling north to reclaim his lands in Romagna. The Pope even gave him an escort. But the escort's captain had his orders. Somewhere on the road to Ostia, the party halted. Cesare was handed over to Spanish agents, formally for his own safety, and placed on a ship bound for Iberia. In Spain, safety meant surveillance. He was first kept under comfortable arrest in Seville, then moved inland. The kings of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, valued him more as a bargaining chip than an ally. His marriage to Charlotte d'Albret, sister to the King of Navarre, gave him just enough leverage to be inconvenient, but not enough to be free. Cesare petitioned for release, for a command, for a chance to prove himself in service. The petitions went unanswered. When they were answered, the response was polite but final. You will remain where you are. Years earlier, the stillness might have broken him. Now it only sharpened him. His health, never fully recovered from the fever that had killed his father, began to decline, but his mind stayed fixed on return. In whispered conversations with loyal captains, he planned an escape. In early 1507 the chance came. Disguised and moving at night, he fled confinement and rode hard toward Navarre, where his brother-in-law offered him sanctuary. But sanctuary was not enough. War was brewing between Navarre and Castile, and Cesare saw in it a final chance to wear armor, to lead men, to be feared again. He took the field at Viana, commanding a small force in the service of Navarre. The morning of March 12th, 1507, dawned grey and wet. Cesare rode out to survey the enemy positions. The rain turned the earth to mire, slowing the horses, masking the sound of approach. In the narrow streets beyond the town's walls, a skirmish broke, sudden, chaotic. Cesare fought his way clear, but in the confusion, he was cut off from his men. When they found his body, it was stripped of armor, his banner gone, his sword missing. 3 deep wounds marked his chest. His killers had left him in the mud, face to the sky, as if daring someone to claim him. They buried him quickly and without ceremony in the local church. No papal envoy came, no royal guard. Lucrezia, upon hearing the news in Ferrara, locked herself in her chambers for 3 days. When she emerged, she wore black and did not speak of her brother again. In Rome, Julius II did not speak the name either. The Borgia standard was lowered from the papal walls and stored away in the archives, unmentioned in the next day's records. Cesare Borgia, once the terror of Italy, the prince who might have been king, had died far from the marble and silk of his making. In the mud, in the rain, at 31 years old, and with him, the House of Borgia's dream of an empire ended. With Cesare gone, Lucrezia stood alone as the last Borgia of power and position. Ferrara was her refuge now, and her prison. The Este court, proud and cautious, had accepted her for her dowry and her connections, and for the prestige of being tied, however tenuously, to the papal throne. Yet the papacy was no longer in Borgia hands, and the family name had turned from a weapon into a liability. She understood the rules here. Speak softly, smile often, never seem too clever. But she also understood her worth. She turned her salons into centers of influence, welcoming poets, artists, and envoys, weaving Ferrara into the wider web of Italian politics with a quiet hand. The scandals that had chased her in Rome faded into whispers. Here, she could be the cultured duchess, the pious patron, the poised mother, and she played the part so well that many began to believe it. She was not without enemies. The Este family had never fully trusted her, and in Rome, Julius II kept a watchful eye on her correspondence. But Lucrezia had learned from her father and brother that power could be maintained without overt defiance, if one mastered the art of making people believe you no longer sought it. She commissioned works of art that flattered the Este legacy, donated generously to convents and hospitals, and oversaw court ceremonies with an elegance that made her indispensable. Yet in her private letters, those that survived, there are traces of a sharper will, advice to allies on how to counter Julius's ambitions, quiet encouragement to friends in Rome, who still remembered the Borgias with loyalty. She could no longer play openly for the board, but she could still move pieces in the dark. By 1519, her health had begun to falter. Pregnant again in her late 30s, she faced the risk with a kind of resigned dignity. Childbirth had always been a gamble. She had lost children before, and she knew the cost. As the summer heat pressed over Ferrara, she withdrew from public appearances, attending only the most essential functions. In June, she went into labor. It was long and brutal, and when it was over, both mother and child were fading. Lucrezia lingered for several days, her strength ebbing. Those who attended her final hours said she remained calm, speaking little, receiving the last rites without fear. She died on June 24th, 1519, at the age of 39. The bells of Ferrara tolled for her, and the court wore mourning black. In Rome, there was no official word. The Borgia name passed quietly into memory, its last great figure gone. What remained was not a dynasty, but a legend, half forgotten by its friends, and kept alive by its enemies. History did not bury the Borgias, it embalmed them. Cesare's campaigns, Lucrezia's beauty, Rodrigo's reign, all preserved in stories told and retold, their edges sharpened or softened depending on the teller. They were no longer people but symbols. Ambition in a cardinal's robe, a smile beneath a veil, a hand resting lightly on the hilt of a sword. And in the years that followed, their shadows proved more enduring than their crowns. Machiavelli, who had once followed Cesare through Romagna, wrote The Prince with the Duke still haunting his thoughts. He held Cesare up as the model of what a ruler must be, decisive, feared, adaptable. Yet in the same breath, he held him up as a warning that even brilliance cannot outrun fortune forever. Lucrezia's memory became a battlefield. In Ferrara, she was remembered as a pious duchess and generous patron, a woman who brought poets to court and tended to the poor. In Rome, her name was muttered in candlelit confessionals, wrapped in tales of poison rings and whispered lovers. The truth, as always, was more complex, more human, and less convenient for those who needed her as a villain or a saint. She was both, and neither, depending on the eye of the beholder. In time, the Borgia name drifted from politics into myth. Painters imagined their faces, playwrights borrowed their sins, novelists wove them into tapestries of intrigue and seduction. They were remembered in excess, the chestnuts, the silk, the daggers in the dark. Some of it true, some of it rumor repeated so often that truth no longer mattered. Their enemies had been thorough in shaping the legend, and the world had been eager to believe it. Yet even through the distortion, a certain reality remains. For a brief and burning moment, they reshaped the very heart of Christendom, and though the centuries dulled their deeds into stories, their shadow still falls across every telling of power, ambition, and the price paid when neither knows restraint. And so, from the marble halls of the Vatican to the fortresses of Romagna, from Ferrara's courts to the shadowed streets of Rome, the echo of the Borgias endures, not in decrees or coronations, but in the uneasy way power is remembered, in the turning of a key in a lock, in the flicker of a candle guttering in a quiet corridor, in the pause before a signature is set to parchment. Their dynasty may have fallen in sickness and exile, but ambition, once lit, does not fade. It passes from hand to hand, name to name, and somewhere tonight, behind a closed door, someone is weighing the same old bargain, what they are willing to pay, and what they are willing to become. If you are still with us, dear listener, thank you. In this late hour, when the streets outside lie hushed and the day's ambitions are folded away, it is no small thing to remain here, in story. You have walked with us through palaces gilded and stained, stood at deathbeds where the air was heavy with both incense and rumor, looked into the faces of those who loved and betrayed in the same breath, and perhaps, as you lie there now, eyes growing heavy, breath slow, you feel it too, that the Borgias, though gone, still walk beside us, in the halls of politics, in the games of influence, in the quiet calculations made behind smiles. For in their rise and their ruin is a truth older than Rome itself, that power is never only won, it is traded for, stolen for, bled for, and always borrowed, never kept. The wealth of the papal vaults, the gold-threaded banners, the cities that bent the knee, all of it passed on, just as all power must. But the stories remained, stories sharpened by enemies, softened by admirers, blurred by centuries, until myth and memory became one. As you drift now towards sleep, wrapped in darkness, adrift among the murmurs of history, know that you carry a fragment of that legacy with you, not as a burden, but as a reminder that every empire, every dynasty, every name written in fire will in time fade to ash. But the light it cast along the way will linger in shadow long after the flames are gone. Let the candles burn low, let the doors close gently, and rest knowing that though the house of Borgia is dust, its story will never truly go silent. Good night, from Renaissance Rome.